Can you be both an autodidact and a polymath? Is there really a difference between the two? I think the short answer is that you pretty much have to be autodidactic in order to be polymathic, at least to a certain degree. If there's an exception to this rule, I'm unaware of it, and I've been studying the fields of learning and memory for decades. And as you learn more about how to become both autodidactic and polymathic, I'm going to share some examples that I think will help you better understand why these two categories are tied at the hip. And I think you can become both at the same time, even if you really have to. And, I'm not sure that there's a difference here, but if there is one, here is what I believe is the only difference between autodidacticism and being polymathic. And I don't want to sound arrogant, but hear me out, please. The only real difference between the two happens when an autodidact believes that he or she has learned on their own. I mean, seriously, how can anyone learn on their own? We need books written by others. At the very least, if we just leave it in the realm of books, how could you ever learn on your own? Doesn't really make sense. Now, this doesn't mean that you cannot teach yourself in a way that resembles the general meaning of autodidacticism as someone who, quote unquote, teaches themselves. But really, they're not really teaching themselves. The standard definition of learning without a teacher simply does not make sense. Someone had to create the learning material. Even if you're Darwin and discovering the laws of nature behind the theory of evolution, someone else taught him language and the principles of science during his time. Someone laid that bridge, put the foundations down, and it is a combination of being with others that leads to the inspiration to go out and study new things, explore uncharted territories, insofar as there even are uncharted territories anymore. So it comes down to, I think, something else that we need to ask about, which we will ask about in this episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. This is Dr. Anthony Metivier from magneticmerrymethod.com. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the program. I am delighted to always be creating these deep dives into what learning is, what it means, who can learn in different ways. And, I think the puzzle of our times is personal volition. If there's something special that autodidacts have that others do not, it's not that they teach themselves or that they somehow learn on their own for the reason that I just mentioned. It's their drive to take the reins of learning into their own hands. The drive itself, where does that come from? In previous years on this podcast, we've talked about potentially improving your IQ. There's writing that I've done about life lessons from people who enjoy higher IQ that you can find at magneticmerrymethod.com. And we've seen in the past that at some level, you, and I'm talking about you listening to me now, you have to define your own goals, but you have to have the personal volition to want to create those goals in the first place. You have to personally define at some intrinsic level what intelligence means for you. What meaning does learning have for you? Now, that's not to say that you get to create your own definitions and categories of what learning is and what it means, but we know from research presented by Nir Eyal, who's the author of Indistractable, he's been on the podcast before, we know from Duke University research recently that making your own definitions and applying them to a crafted self-identity do lead to better memory and learning outcomes. You just have to choose that you will define yourself. And if you feel like you're lacking in will, that's okay. Go back into the Magnetic Memory Method archives. Look at my material on the blog about mental strength. Give the exercises there a try. I've personally found them incredibly empowering. I never share things that I haven't tried and found useful. And, there's more exercises for you in my TEDx Talk if you've never seen that. And coming up, I'm going to be opening the Magnetic Memory Method Inner Circle, which I normally don't talk about. You really have normally to be in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass before that Inner Circle is even announced. But I'm going to change things up a little bit. It's been many, many years, and it would be wonderful to have you be part of it. So if you do want to be notified when the inner circle opens up, make sure to go to magneticmerrymethod.com and at least have the free course. People who haven't completed that free course never hear about these things because it only makes sense for us to have a common language in terms of one of the 5 main memory systems that we use in the magnetic memory method in order to be able to learn faster, remember more, and not struggle so much to deal with information overwhelm. And that's one thing that we have to do in order to become autodidactic polymaths, people who know lots and lots of different topics. And it is a wonderful thing to know a lot about different things. And so, when we think about an autodidact, this is someone who takes responsibility for learning in a holistic way from others. And that's part of what my inner circle is about, having us get together to learn from each other. And we often can learn from each other's questions. And, an autodidact doesn't necessarily need the presence of teachers or hands-on guidance as much as others. And as it happens, there are some personality traits that polymaths exhibit, and I've discussed them on the podcast before. You can learn to adopt these things. You can model them. And there's many, many examples, and I try to feature as many as I can in my work. Ramon Lull, I know some people pronounce his name Yu, and I think that it can be pronounced that way, but for people who don't know of those possible pronunciations, I usually call him Ramon Lull. We've talked a lot about Giordano Bruno on this podcast, Robert Flood, there's St. Augustine, St. Aquinas, more contemporary people, Francis Yates, who wrote the great Art of Memory, Lynn Kelly, Ben Cardell, he's been on the podcast. He's billed as the modern-day Sherlock Holmes. He knows a ton about all kinds of different topics. Tony Buzan, of course, who's gone to the great memory palace in the sky. Lots and lots of cases that I could cite. And there's many polymathic autodidacts that I haven't had on the podcast and hope to in the future. And it really helps to grow the numbers on screens in order to get invitations out there to have people on the podcast. So if you ever want to help out with that, make sure you're subscribed over on my YouTube channel and hitting those like buttons, etc., because that is an important signal for those things. In any case, I would suggest that there are some ways that are easy peasy, lemon squeezy to become an autodidactic polymath, and I really don't know about the personal volition issue. It's put me in a bit of a bind, but I believe everyone can become an autodidactic polymath, and there are simple and direct activities to do so. And if you can find the personal volition and your willpower to do it, this is some of what I would suggest that you do. So the first thing is to commit to a lifelong journey. As John Michael Greer, he's another autodidactic polymath who's been on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast, he points out in a very wonderful book of his called The Druidry Handbook, initiation or beginning in something, it may mean beginning a learning project, for example, within a tradition like Druidry, or if you become involved even just in my free course at magneticmerrymethod.com, you may be considered an initiate, bringing yourself to the beginning of a journey into the great memory tradition. But he says that it's not really just about beginning. The word initiation means that you are taking on something at scale as a lifelong project. And, I may have some confirmation bias here and I'm reading into it and making it more than it is, but he does seem to suggest that, and these are the words that he has in the book, he says the commitment is a focus on reshaping your relationship to the earth. And when I get, people, or I work so hard to, let's say, to inspire people to work on their memory and be involved in the memory tradition, I am also doing that. It is about being committed to a relationship to your mind, to your memory. And when it comes to becoming an autodidactic polymath, I suggest that that's exactly what you do. Commit to the journey of lifelong learning, be all in, and cherish your memory. Nurture it, polish it, keep it shiny and clean and bright. And I know, be all in might ring like a cliche in some ears, but in my own lifelong study, I often remember Gilles Deleuze's warning that the war against cliche is a terrible thing. And I agree. We just absolutely have to be all in. And it is the great mystery why some have the inspiration and some don't. But that's part of it. Just commit. If you don't have personal volition, you can't get yourself to do things. Commit to figuring out why and make that part of your lifelong journey. Just learning about willpower and the issues around that is something that, if you can get yourself to commit to it as a lifelong journey, that would be the most fascinating journey in the world. And there are people who have taken it. So one thing that helps me commit is to have a pain that I know I need to solve and really analyze what is it that I want to do and what is it that I need to do. And then try to get rid of the wants and focus on the needs. And in different projects, there's different want-need issues that need to be sorted out. But it's a very simple exercise, but just because it's simple doesn't mean that it's not useful. And you'll find that this is taught again and again and again by many people all around the world, and it really does work. It's a pen and some paper, and you just do a want-need analysis. And, like, these are the things I want to do, but these are the things I really need to do. And then you focus on what is it that you need to do, and you get doing it. And it's just that. What is it in the Shawshank Redemption? Get busy dying or get busy living. It's just that simple. And that's a huge part of what I think is absolutely essential. Commit to anything and get started and stick with it and treat it as a lifelong journey, whatever it is. You can change later, but that Duke University research that I was mentioning vaguely, let me mention it a little more specifically because I think it pertains here. Also, Nirial's research in Indistractable, a great book. If you create a mental model or you assign yourself a mental model, you're much more likely to be able to do things because you've got some kind of reference point. So we see this in culture all the time. So, often, well, let's take Tony Buzan from the memory championship world. He created the idea of the grandmaster of memory and the warrior of the mind. And these are images. These are mental models that help you refer to something that's bigger than yourself so that you can get yourself pointed in the direction of that image. It's a great image, being a warrior of the mind or a grandmaster of memory. And the Duke University research, what they did, and this pertains specifically to memory, our topic here on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast and the world of this project in general, is they got people, there's two groups of people in the study, and half the group, one of the groups went into the art gallery and they just looked at art. The other group were told to pretend that they were art thieves planning a heist. And the people who pretended that they were art thieves planning a heist, they remembered so much more about what they saw in the art gallery than those who didn't. And the numbers are quite shocking. Anyway, if you search on Google for art gallery and Duke University research, you can read it for yourself, and it is just fascinating. And I know it to be true the instant that I saw it because I've used mental models for a long time. And I know how to do it from very old philosophy. Philosophers have used it a lot. And it is something I talk about in The Victorious Mind. And in The Victorious Mind, I chose Poseidon for the cover. And the cover, was partly I chose him because I sometimes thought of that, someone in control of the ocean, because my mind sloshes around sometimes and I really need it to not slosh around. So just thinking about being that powerful enough to calm the seas actually has an effect. And this has been shown in studies. So that might be the thing that gets you to commit. And I don't know exactly what the right image for you is, but if you get yourself to do the exercise, I bet you'll find a great image for yourself in this regard, because it is really difficult to fail if you take action. You'll be exploring, and that exploration itself will open up so much. All right, so that's the first thing, is commit to a lifelong journey. And if you can't think of what your lifelong journey might be, Well, find someone who inspires you, and then see if you can't get involved in that. And even if you can't take on the whole kit and caboodle that they've done, maybe what you can do is support them and figure out who supported them, and commit to that. There's different levels to things, and you don't have to be necessarily the big go-getter who stands in the limelight. You can also be one of the people who supports the go-getter. All right, the second thing that I would suggest is to ditch one very, very nasty and pernicious myth, and it is the myth of having a learning style. Now, I think there is such a thing as a learning type, but not a style. And people tell me all the time, oh, I'm so visual, this should be easy for me, these memory techniques. Or they say, I can't really see images in my mind, and I'm a much more auditory learner, or I'm a kinesthetic learner, and so forth. And according to the American Psychological Association, believing in these learning styles is detrimental to a lot of people. I'm convinced that it's worse than detrimental. I've seen this kind of belief that you're a visual learner or you're a auditory learner and all this stuff. I've seen it hold so many people back. I think that what it breaks down to is that there are people who want to know what something is. They want to know how it works. They want to know, why they should do things in a particular way. And then there's other people who just want the action steps. And I think those also present problems for learners because they get stuck in those ruts. But the idea that you are a more visual learner and so forth, this has just been debunked in the science. Tasia Marshik has a TEDx talk that goes into her research, and long story short, she basically says you got to do some critical self-reflection and think about why you think that you have that style. Because chances are you encountered it during a moment of the history of your life, and it is part of a historical period of institutionalized education. And when it comes to you and I as individual learners, the truth is that we cannot afford to focus on just one learning style that is a myth, right? We have to be aware of the many types of mental imagery that we have the ability to draw upon. And if we feel weak in a certain area, if we really believe that, my auditory learning skills are not that good, well, then you can really rewire your brain. And you can do it in such a way that points the path to being more polymathic and being a better autodidact. Because why would you want to leave any of the sensations behind, right? So I would encourage you that if you have any doubt or skepticism about what I'm saying, look up the research for yourself. But at the end of the day, this just makes sense on its face. You see, you hear, you taste, you touch, you smell, like all of these things. You think emotionally, and those all can be strengthened. But not one amongst us is somehow super weighted in a super visual area. If you can see, you can see. That's just the way that is. And I'm happy to be corrected about that. But so far, the research is not showing that, and just common sense would say that when we're stuck somewhere else, most of us. And we are often stuck in I'm wasting my time on trying to figure out how this works instead of just taking action with it. Or, I need to know why this works before that I do it. And it's just nobody knows why memory techniques work, for example. We don't even know where consciousness is produced by the brain. So, why get hung up on why do we use memory palaces in this particular way? Because I don't know why we do. I don't know why there is a thing called memory in the first place, and I don't think anybody else does either. It's just part of, an evolution story. Maybe you could tell it scientifically and get somewhere, but that doesn't really help explain why space exists or why the alphabet exists and why sounds can be organized in such a way that they match with what alphabetical letters look like and so forth. I mean, if that's your bag and you want to make that your lifelong learning goal to figure out all that stuff, cool, why not do it? But it shouldn't hold you back because you have some kind of belief that there's a learning style. Okay, so that is a huge part of being a polymathic autodidact. You can't get hung up on that stuff. You don't have time. You just got to learn with all possible senses and figure out what your hang-ups are and then keep moving forward. The next step would be to become an expert reader and researcher. And I do mean expert. There are some things that good researchers and readers do that people who are not quite as good don't do. So a huge part of one of my programs, Read with Momentum, helps people find the best possible information as quickly as possible and read it and comprehend it based on research skills that I learned in university, part of my BA, my MA, my second MA, my PhD. I also worked in 3 libraries. So when it comes to doing deep, thorough, intensive research, I have a fair amount of background in it, and it's helped me a lot, and it will help you too if you ever want to get involved in Read with Momentum. The lion's share really boils down to choosing the best possible books to read in the first place. And then if you want to read faster, really make sure that your vocabulary, both generally and technically, supports dealing with the kinds of books that you want to read. And this sort of comes back to having well-formed goals and a lifelong commitment to a particular topic or a set of topics. So let's talk a little bit more about goals. The first thing I would say is that many people flounder because they just simply don't dream big enough. And when they do, they don't dream about goals that are actually worth pursuing over the long term. So I don't want to be repetitive, but you got to rule out a lot of learning goals that aren't worth pursuing in advance, and it helps to think critically about your goal creation. So this is kind of like want-need analysis, but another way of dealing with this is mind mapping. And I've done a lot of mind mapping over the years, and it has been really helpful in terms of making sure that goals are actually worth pursuing, because you can create that central image in a mind map and then have these tendrils that go out, or tributaries, and work out what are the individual pieces. And then, sometimes you have a goal and you get to like the 5th commitment that you have to make, and you're like, no, this is not what I want to do. So you move on to the next goal and the next goal. In any case, there's a lot of material about learning goals on previous episodes of the podcast. But that is a big part of it, is ruling out what is not really worth doing so you can focus on what is. The next tip that I'll share with you is to be part of a larger group. There's a mythical aspect to autodidacticism, the idea that anyone learns on their own. That's as pernicious as the idea that people have learning styles. In reality, we all need each other, and participating in groups is essential. It helps in terms of getting rapid feedback, it stimulates reflective thinking, and even if you're an introvert, you can be involved with other people. It's really important. I used to be introverted to a certain extent, or I bought into the idea that I was. I don't think that actually it made sense in quite that way that it's described, but I worked on changing my shyness, and I'll spare the long story for now, but I'm not at all introverted now or extroverted, but I make sure that I meet and collaborate with as many people as I can. And it's important. Don't skip this step. Don't think that learning on your own is ever really on your own. So much learning is done through other people, and you can skip a lot of steps and avoid a lot of mistakes. And the more people you know, the more you can know through a network of people. The next step is just keep going, even when it gets tough. If you're going to learn things on your own, even though we have the myth of on your own, but you're going to spend a lot of time in reading and reflection while you're literally by yourself, things are going to get challenging. They're going to get challenging no matter what, because if you do have to interact with a lot of people, even especially when you don't want to, those distractions are going to be really tough. But you got to keep going. People who learn continuously cannot afford to allow distractions to get in their way. You need resilience. You need the ability to pivot when necessary. And what that boils down to is essentially habits based on systems. And, I sometimes go through periods where I let myself get distracted, and it sucks, and I have to keep going. And there are tough times, perhaps now more than ever in my career, but keep focusing, keep going. And there's projects that are so big now. I take on more and more ambitious things, and I have to follow these rules. I was working on learning Chinese at a time when I was super distracted several years ago, and I've told this story before. I put my Freedom Journal on my pillow so that I saw it before I went to bed, and then I put it on the floor so I saw it when I woke up, to help make sure that I was learning enough Chinese to really make a visit that I was invited to be in China as successful as possible. And later I completed a certificate in Chinese. I've done all kinds of things with the Freedom Journal in order to just get it done during tough times. And it is so powerful. I really can't recommend something like that enough. I keep thinking of making a magnetic memory method journal, but at the end of the day, I have an idea specifically for people who use memory techniques, but until I get that done, I've got other priorities. You see, it's like want versus need analysis. I do that too, and I want a journal, but I don't need to create a journal because there are other good ones. And my idea for a journal is so quirky for just people who are using the most advanced memory techniques that I could just explain it to you. And you can just make it yourself. You could actually modify a Freedom Journal to have it. But at the end of the day, I do have some ideas that I think are really going to help people who want to use advanced memory techniques. But the point is that you just got to figure out your own system at the end of the day. And that's another reason why making a journal is on my want to do, but not my need to do. Because in The Victorious Mind, I talk about this. I use a lot of different journals, and experimenting with multiple styles of journals, inventing your own style of journaling. That's so key. So let's, throw that on the pile of suggestions for you. Journaling helps with being consistent, and it kind of makes your life motivation proof in a certain way. It develops this metacognition, which is thinking about how you're thinking. And, a very, very smart guy is Johannes Malo. He's been on the podcast. He gave us journaling tips that are priceless for a heavily performance-based outcome. And even if you're not a mental and memory athlete like he is, his journaling tips are priceless. I'm sure you'll get ideas that you can apply to whatever it is that you want to do as the architect of your dreams. So check out that episode with Johannes Malo, Mallow. Really, really inspiring guy too. And when we talk about people with challenges, I don't want to dwell on it, but he's traveled the world and he's done it with some very, very severe challenges, and he does it for the love of memory, but he is able to accomplish what he accomplishes because of how he tracks his performance and really gets into the granular details of where he needs to improve. And his journaling tips, again, are priceless. So don't miss those. I would also suggest this. Invest experimentally in your education. Now, what the heck does that mean? Well, let me put it this way. A lot of people have emailed me over the years and they say to me, I'm afraid that it won't be worth it to get one of your books or your courses. And I get that, but at the same time, I think it's inherently false. At least it's questionable. Every educational experience is valuable. Even if you wind up not understanding something, or you decide not to implement an idea or a technique, you deserve kudos for being willing to expose yourself to the information. And there's a theory, and I admit that it's just a theory, but a lot of people say that in research that they found overall, with the big numbers, that people who just submit themselves, so to speak, to educational experiences over the large grand scope of things, they benefit. So if you feel that you would be held back in terms of becoming autodidactic or polymathic, I suggest you think like an investor. Risk is not going away. But in this particular case, the risk is so minimal. You can't really waste your time. At least you've learned that something isn't for you if it turns out that it isn't for you. And quite frankly, in the rare event that you find absolutely nothing useful in a book or a course, at least you know, right? And a friend of mine, Rob, he always reminds me of this Alan Moore quote, where Alan Moore says, if you want to be a good writer, you better spend some time reading bad books, because you can't afford not to avoid bad writing, right? And how do you know what's bad? Well, you read bad stuff. I think there's so much truth to that. And how do you know what's bad advice, in memory improvement? Well, it's easy. You take lots of memory courses. And, sometimes courses are bad in different ways and they're good in different ways. And sometimes you can't really spot the value right away. There's a problem in our world. People are sometimes so just looking for the dopamine spike. They're looking for some sort of transformative moment right now, absolutely now. And they miss so much tremendous value because they are not investors. So I have at times in my life felt foolish for my short-sightedness and rejecting books or courses that, I didn't get instant value from. But I have corrected that many, many times by going back, looking at them again. And so that's what the investor does. And it's absolutely fantastic. If you've ever seen my bookshelf that's behind me in my YouTube videos, a lot of those books, they're all worth it, but not every one of them felt worth it immediately. And some of them, I'll admit, still don't quite feel worth it, but they're worth it anyway, because now I know. And that's what an investor is like as an autodidactic polymath. Now, I've shared a lot of tips on this episode and busted some myths, and there really is no such thing as going it alone, especially when it comes to knowledge. So for best results, feel free to visit these tips again, but if there's one thing that we haven't talked about yet in too much detail, it's improving your memory. And once it's improved, maintain it for mental fitness. There's many, many ancient memory techniques that I'm aware of and that I teach, and we go deep in them in the Magnetic Memory Method world. So if you would like to get involved, take the free course at magneticmerrymethod.com. It walks you through the core accelerated learning techniques in just 4 videos, includes 3 powerful worksheets. It's not required that you add information to your mind like I have about memory science or the history of memory techniques as part of your journey, but those things can help inspire you and create that personal volition, because you're like, what? This guy lived this life? Like Giordano Bruno, or there's so many characters that had such bizarre lives. And it's just kind of like, wow, this is true adventure, because those guys really cared about information and knowledge. And, you can just be inspired by what they went through. But, you don't have to do all the things that I've done. You can just get that free course and learn the core techniques and apply them to whatever it is that you're interested in, whatever it is that's going to get you the raise, that's going to get you the promotion. You just got to make that commitment to a lifelong adventure of learning based on principles that have been working for people for thousands of years. And when you do, power to you. Thanks again for listening. This is, again, Dr. Anthony Metivier from magneticmerrymethod.com. Come and visit me over at the site. And until we have a chance to speak again, as I always like to say, keep yourself magnetic.